Okay, so the only announcements that I want to make is there's a reminder that we have our exam 5, our final exam for the course tomorrow. It's not cumulative in the sense of containing materials from each and every module, but it does build on concepts. So you've probably noticed it, talked about keystone species was one example that was brought up again in this module that you have seen in previous modules. But focus on the modules, was it T19 through 22? That is what the exam is going to be focused on. And then just a reminder that for this exam, you can use a note card for those calculations because you will have to do some of the energy efficiency calculations. But again, this is, as the announcement said, it's not a complete cheat sheet, so you can't put just anything on the note card. I really just want you to put any of those types of calculations on there so you can focus on the conceptual understanding and not have to memorize the simple math for it. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to the group for questions.
I was struggling with the nitrogen nutrient cycling. Can we go through that section?
Sure.
And then for the exam, are we going to need to have the chemical equations memorized? Like in the matching part, there was some that were just chemical equations, and those were a little more difficult for me just because I don't have all those equations memorized.
You will have to be familiar with those chemical compounds that were in the activities. I mean, it won't ask you to say write out bicarbonate, like it's not going to be that specific, but it might just give you the chemical compounds and ask you to answer a question about it. So you will have to recognize what, ammonium is NH4 if it says that. So.
Okay, yeah, it was like in the cogbooks activities, there were some that were, had some explanation, and then some that was just like NO to NO3, I think. So hold on, let me get there.
Yeah, so I think
some of those activities I couldn't really, I think partly it was like I couldn't tell what I was looking at in the pictures, which made it more confusing.
That's fair. And I think maybe this is a good opportunity to go over some of those images and we can kind of confirm what we're looking at. So we can see can we see my screen right here? Okay. Yeah, so why don't we just go through and we can just describe what's happening here. So this one has kind of the words on here, so it's a little bit more helpful. But in general, what is happening with this picture on the bottom left?
It's an animal decomposing.
Yeah, and how do they describe decomposition in the nitrogen cycle? They use a different word for it than decomposition, but it is decomposing.
Mineralization, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, so that would be a picture of mineralization. And then what about this picture right here? What's going on here?
Is that nitrification? Is that what's happening in the soil? It's soil uptaking.
And what I guess these are kind of two of the more difficult pictures that I had when I first looked at that.
Yeah.
So what's the difference of these? Maybe let's back up a step. How do these two pictures differ?
To me, one looks like loose soil and one looks more like it might be like rocky matter.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to start this. What else about it? Like, what might you find in this soil that you're probably not going to find in this soil?
Moisture.
To some extent, possibly. I mean, this looks drier than this soil. I agree with that picture.
In the darker soil, there would be higher amounts of nitrogen than the lighter soil.
And why is that?
As the soil dries out, the chemical composition, I mean, maybe not the actual like drying out of the soil, but the photo on the left shows like a freshly decomposed organism or like a freshly amendment of nitrogen, whereas the one on the right would be one that's been spent. And so there would be lesser amounts of nitrogen on the right.
I would agree with that. In general, this is more fertile soil because it's a little more porous. So like we talked about being loose, there's more oxygen in that soil. There's more bacteria in that soil that can do the denitrification versus this is more of like an arid soil or a anoxic soil. So there's a lot more life in this soil. You can think of it almost as like topsoil versus like a low quality soil, such as maybe clay that doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it.
Okay, so what is happening in the like the loose soil could
So-
be the denitrification.
So that would be more the nitrification
That's
of
what I
ammonium. Yeah.
thought. Okay.
So what happens during nitrification of ammonium?
Ammonium. Oh, go ahead.
The recent breakdown of an organism is putting nitrogen into the soil. Whereas in the denitrification, I guess maybe through like solar radiation, it's breaking down the nitrogen and making the nitrogen less available.
What is converting the ammonium to nitrates in this picture?
Bacteria.
Yeah, so there's a lot of bacterial action going on here, and that's the nitrification process of ammonium. And denitrification in this soil, that tends to happen in, we talked about anaerobic conditions with poor soil quality. So that's what's going on here. Does that make sense a little bit how these two soil pictures differ?
Yeah.
Are there any questions more about it, or if there are, I mean, that's fine. I just want to make sure that I'm being a little clear on that.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense.
Okay, and what's happening in this picture up here?
Combustion.
Yeah, there's fire, right? That's what it's trying to show. So that's some type of combustion. And in cases of nitrogen, when things burn, what is released generally from the fire?
Like a nitrous oxide,
Yeah, or nitric oxide. Yeah, that one.
nitric
So-
oxide, sorry.
No worries. I mean, I think you would have gotten it if you would have seen it in a multiple choice. So yeah, so this is the release or the breakdown of organic nitrogen, which releases nitric oxide. So that's nitrogen combining with oxygen in the combustion process. And then what are we looking at in this picture in general? Like, what is this green thing?
It's like plants or on the cellular level, maybe.
Yeah, it's a microscope image of plant cells. And it's showing the individual cells in here.
So
And
would that be assimilation of nitrogen?
It is, or not assimilation of,
Oh, I'm sorry,
Nitrogen.
of ammonium.
yeah. And what does assimilation mean again?
The plant is uptaking that ammonium into into itself. So assimilation is essentially like an absorption process, right?
Exactly, it's absorption. So when we eat food, do we assimilate all the food that we eat? Or when a plant takes in a certain amount of food, does it assimilate 100% of that food?
No,
Why not?
because there's elements of that our body just either it's in excess or our body doesn't have the ability to absorb.
Exactly. And how does it pass that then? How does it get rid of it if it doesn't absorb all of it?
Are we talking about in plants? It converts it into another.
In general, there's a word I'm thinking of that could be for plants or animals.
Excretion.
Yeah, or waste, right? Some type of waste. It passes through the body. And we don't have to get into the details of, what the waste of humans versus plants, but just that simple concept of they bring in a certain amount of ammonium in this instance, and then they absorb some of it, and then they don't because they don't absorb all of it, they have to, pass some of it through waste. So that kind of, and I was just kind of trying to link that a little bit back to the energy efficiencies to see how the kind of the modules are related too. So what about this picture right here? What's going on here?
That would be consumption of organic nitrogen.
Yeah, what's doing the consuming and what's being consumed in the picture?
I guess is that a mountain lion?
Yeah, I mean, it
Whatever
looks
the
like
cat
maybe
is.
an African lion to me, but an
Yeah.
animal of some sort.
Yeah, so a cat of some sorts is eating the flesh of another organism or the meat of
Yeah,
another
so
organism
it's
and
an
consuming
animal.
nitrogen in that way.
Yeah, I would just, an animal eating meat, but that's consumption of organic nitrogen, right? So we would go with this one. And there's kind of some overlap between the carbon, the nitrogen, and the phosphorus cycle with when they talk about organic and assimilation and decomposition, right? Those all have to deal with living organisms that are in the picture. And then this last one, I guess, to be fair, is a living organism too, but what's happening in this picture? What are we looking at?
I did nodules, like root nodules, probably of a legume or something like that.
Yeah, so in general, this is a root system, right?
Mhm.
As you said, and then these bumps are kind of the nodules, and then that's where fixation of nitrogen gas is taking place in the root system. Yeah, and we got them right. So are there any more questions on these pictures? Are they a little more clear now that we've talked about them? I do wish cogbooks would have a description, something like cat eating food would be useful, or microscope slide of plants. But
Yeah, it was when we went to I think it's the next one where it's just the chemical equations. That's where I started to have trouble, because some of those equations, like in the description when we are in the chapter, like here, I felt okay about what was happening. But when you get to just the chemical equations, because in the description of the chapter, I was like, well, this wasn't in.
yeah, so right here,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm. This is where I had problems.
Yeah, and this is, they don't spell it out, I would say maybe 100% in the readings, but they do define like what these chemicals compounds are. And then in some of the, it's just knowing like this is ammonia being converted into nitrates. So like
Mhm.
being able to say that is going to be useful for the exam, and then knowing which of these processes that occurs in is what the question is asking for.
So that's nitrification, right? Which would be,
Oh, the first one right here.
yeah. Which would be the loose soil.
Yep. Yeah, it would be this one. Exactly right. And there's a new one on here. Obviously, now we have lightning. That wasn't an example in the previous one. Let's talk about that one first, maybe. What's happening? What does lightning do?
Lightning is another form of nitrogen fixation, right?
Well, not necessarily nitrogen fixation, but it's a form
Doesn't
of,
it just turn the gas into a solid, basically?
yeah, it hits atmospheric nitrogen and converts it into nitrates. So it's another form of nitrification.
Oh, I have it under nitrogen.
So it'd be the N2 to NO3 negative.
Yes, it would be this one. Yeah, because you have
Yeah,
atmospheric nitrogen gas being turned into a nitrate.
yeah, I also have it under nitrogen fixation because I
Yeah.
think in the cog books, it was in the nitrogen fixation as an example
Mhm.
of how nitrogen fixation can also occur. So that's a little confusing.
Yeah.
I'll make a note of that in my notes, and we can go back and double check that in cog books too.
Yeah, because it had the examples where like nitrogen fixation can occur by organisms, lightning, or the industrial production of fertilizers.
Okay, I mean, that's if it, you found it where it is. Do you know what section? That would, I guess, probably just be in the,
Yeah, it's just
in
under
the,
the
how nitrogen
cycle.
cycles, yeah.
Mhm.
And then, so what is the main difference between nitrogen fixation and nitrification? It looks like so like I have the nitrification is the process of converting atmospheric nitrogen into forms like ammonia and then which is rapidly converted to ammonium or into a nitrate. So are nitrogen fixation and nitrification closely related or involved with each other?
They are, because if we look at the two processes, right, this one only, they both concern the conversion of nitrogen gas. So from the atmosphere, so they start exactly the same with the same nitrogen gas. This one only converts it into nitrates. This one can convert it into ammonia or nitrates. So the plant has the process, like a more complex process. It can use nitrogen in more than one process compared to the lightning only has a single process.
And then, so the best way to differentiate that, would it be what the end, like the end chemical or ion is, or whether it's plant or like outside, or is there like or is it not that straightforward?
It would just be the entire process. So I think looking at the end process, because they start the same, so the start process doesn't matter. It's going to be the end process that is going to make the difference between these two pictures. So I think knowing like that when this happens with lightning, it can only turn it into nitrates. When it happens with a plant, it has to have that ore, so it can be more complex.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then what about this top one then? What's happening up here?
Oh, that's the, hold on, I can't see. That's where organic nitrogen is turning back into nitric oxide.
Yeah. And that one, it's interesting that they write organic nitrogen and don't write out the chemical compound, but maybe that makes it a little bit easier to remember.
Yeah, you know, the one, so the two bottom ones that are remaining are the ones that I was the most confused on. Like in Cogbooks, it doesn't give you an example for mineralization as far as chemicals. And, you know, it doesn't give you like what under mineralization.
What does it talk about? So this is assimilation or mineralization. So it talks about it can take nitrogen from the soil as either ammonium or nitrates.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
But
it doesn't write it out, but it talks about the parts that are involved.
at the bottom, it just says the process of breaking down organic compounds into inorganic compounds is known as mineralization. And that's where I was like, okay, I understand that part.
Sure.
But then when you get to the chemical equations, I was like, well, which one of these is going to be correct? How do I?
So I think this is the sentence right here that's
Mm-hmm.
important. So the decomposers break down biological nitrogen or organic nitrogen into ammonia.
Okay.
And that's, let's go back to it. It's going to start over, but that's fine. What was it? Where are we?
And sorry to interrupt real quickly, Travis. Are those equations going to be expected to be memorized? Or would that be something we could put on our card?
So these are not the equations that I intended to be on the card. Those are just more the efficiencies equations. So these are chemical compounds.
Okay.
But that's a fair question. So if we talk about which one is what we
Like
just
the-
saw in the text?
Like the decomposing fox, so that would
Yeah.
be, would that be the, which I can't read.
I think
those.
the organic nitrogen to ammonia, NH4
Yeah,
minus.
so it would be that one, right? Because in the text, wish you could open multiple windows. So that was this one right here, because it gives us the breakdown of, it calls it biological nitrogen instead of organic nitrogen, but it compounds into ammonia is what it breaks into in that equation. So I agree, it's not, I dislike they use the word biological because it's not consistent and it does not give you the equation, I agree, but it does in words kind of talk about what happens. Does that make sense, at least a little bit more from the text to the activity? Because there are several emails from students that, had similar questions or concerns about that.
Yeah, I mean, this just goes back to comics, doesn't always explain things very well.
Yeah, I agree with that. It took a few seconds for me to pull it out, and it's not, I don't think it's done the best way because, like I said, it uses different words, biological versus organic, so it's not even consistent. So I agree with that. It's definitely challenging to pull it out of the text.
Yeah, now I'm realizing as I'm like writing down the chemical like in my notes that, so it says in the notes it breaks down into ammonia, but then it gives ammonium as
Yeah,
the chemical. Is that just, it could be both, maybe, like,
That would
and
be
like
my,
with these questions, I really just relied heavily on like process of elimination and like using, like, if I saw organic, I knew it was probably like in a living form of some kind, and just kind of made my way using that kind of processes too.
and that is a good process for these types of activities, a process of elimination to at least get you fewer choices. And then when you get to the end, talk about why the answers are the correct answers. Knowing what's actually happening in the process that we've been discussing is going to be important.
yeah, I think that was the other thing that confused me, like you said, Kyra, is that in my notes, I have ammonium, which is a positive, like NH4 plus, not minus. And then when you go into the activities, it's a different equation. So I think that also was part of what confused me.
Yeah, because here it has the ammonium above it, and that's the NH4 plus that you're talking about from your notes. And then this does say, where was it? Ammonia right here. Yeah, so I'll make a note about that. There are some subtle inconsistencies in cog books with the activities for sure. So that's unfortunate.
We're all human.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
well, that's why you're here to help us.
that's fair. I appreciate the questions and I'm glad we're able to have these and catch these and we can let Cogbooks software developers know. I mean, it is a little frustrating because these are supposed to be proofed like by multiple people and it's almost a waste of time for us to have these little side questions about, is this technically correct? We should be focusing on the bigger conceptual pictures, in my opinion, but it is what it is right now. I appreciate all of your patience on this. Were there any other specific activities in this section that anyone wanted to go over or? Because this was there are a lot of activities in here.
I feel pretty good about it, but could we go over one of the carbon cycles? Just,
Sure.
oh, and I have a question in my notes that I wrote. I don't know where it came up, but at the very end, they were talking about now that we know about carbon pooling, but I don't remember where I saw that. And was that something that we were supposed to understand or have a definition for?
Carbon pooling.
Yeah, it was somewhere like they briefly mentioned it. I was like, is this supposed to be important?
Well, I think what they mean by that is like where carbon can be found in general in the environment.
Okay.
So like beyond that, I don't think it's carbon pooling, from what I recall, is not on the exam specifically.
Great. Then we don't
So-
need to touch on it.
All right, yeah, so why don't we go over this one and just talk about why kind of what each picture is maybe and why the answers are what they are. So when it says production of organic carbon, see now here it gives you the example. This is glucose.
Mhm.
Which one of these is talking about the production of organic carbon?
The plants at the cells, plant cells.
And why is that the correct answer? What are the plants? I mean, they're the ones, I mean, I guess it's written in there, right? Plants produce glucose, right? So this is the
Right.
production of organic carbon, and C6 being the carbon part of glucose is the organic carbon. So we know that this is a primary producer. Again, this is a little bit more zoomed in, even at the cellular level of a microscope slide, essentially of a piece of a plant. And to be fair, I'm not, you've probably seen pictures like that in intro bio, but without a little description, that could be not completely clear. All right, so what about consumption of organic carbon? What's happening in like that description?
It's the the monkey or the ape eating, and that's like it's consuming something.
Yeah, so consumption just means consuming, eating, and it's organic, so it has to be something living. So it's, a living organism consuming another living organism. And then decomposition of organic carbon. So it has the word organic in there, so it has to involve something living. And then we assume we know what decomposition is, right?
Yeah, that dead
Yeah.
whatever.
It would be this dead animal here. And then what about, so these get a little bit maybe more challenging. What about circulation of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide?
That only happens in the air, right? Because carbon monoxide exists in the atmosphere, like up in the air.
Yeah, both of them do. Carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide are gases, right? So knowing that little bit of chemistry background, is there a picture that only involves, maybe two different layers of gases?
Yeah, the atmosphere.
Yeah, so this one, what it looks like, because it's kind of like the edge of the atmosphere where it's reaching space, where it's going from this blue light to this black light. So that's kind of the turnover of two different air areas, or two different air layers. And that would be circulation of two gases. And then this one talks about circulation again of carbon dioxide and carbonic acid. So which one would this refer to?
That happens through like wave activity, like within the ocean, correct?
It does, but we just mentioned before too, carbon dioxide is a gas. How can we generally think of carbonic acid? And what form is it in most of the time? When it's, I would say, stable in the environment. What do we think of? What state of an element do we think of when we think of acids in general?
It's a liquid.
Yeah, so acids are generally liquid at stable form. So this is a gas mixing with a liquid. So that would be why it's the waves, right? We have the water turning over with the air and mixing, circulating carbon dioxide and carbonic acid. So I'd say 99% of the time, if you have something with an acid, it's going to have some form of water and generally waves turning over in the picture.
Right, but the circulation would be anywhere where there's like air bubbles also involved in the liquid, correct?
Yeah, so
Which
it's
is
the
carbon
yeah,
dioxide.
the gas and the liquid where they meet.
Mhm.
That's the circulation of those two compounds.
And then the storage of calcium carbonate happens like on the ocean floor in, you know, the like dead animals, basically, right? Like I think the example that Cogbooks gave, I might be wrong on this, was like the you know, what occurs like when coral reefs die and stuff like that.
Some of it, yes, but I think what it's kind of getting at is it's sedimentation. So you're getting your calcium carbonate is settling on the bottom and getting buried. And when it gets buried under sediment, the bottom of the ocean is where a lot of sediment settles because it's some of the lowest places on Earth. It then is stored there until it's disturbed. And so until maybe an animal digs it out, a ship crashes and falls into it, volcanic eruptions start and it starts opening it. So that's the part of the storage until there's some type of disturbance to draw it out.
Or like human mining activities.
Yeah, human mining, yeah, pretty much, yeah, any type of disturbance, natural or human induced, would be a way to get it out. But until that happens, it's going to settle in there and sink to the bottom and then be stored underneath more sediment.
Oh, that's right. That's what becomes dolomite and limestone. Eventually, if we're talking geologic time.
Yeah. Yeah, if it's stored for long enough, there can be chemical conversions under there and we can have new materials eventually.
And with all of these, like for instance, the sediment, like when it precipitates out and settles on the ocean floor. Now, without the interference of human activities, what would happen is that as some of this carbon is stored, like new carbon would be released in another area. It's like a natural balancing act. But part of the problem is that humans have, through our mining activities and all of that, are releasing additional carbon sources, right?
Yeah. Or fishing, if they use dredging where they drag the nets on the bottom of the ocean, that stirs up all the sediment, kills the plant life that also does some of the storing, and opens up the sediment that does storing too. Yeah, so there's multiple ways that it can come out.
But it's that human alteration of the overall nutrient cycles, right? That is because what we're doing really is adding more of each of these nutrients to the environment than would naturally exist under normal circumstances.
In general, I would agree with that, but it can be hard to define normal circumstances because places where volcanoes start coming up, that chemistry is going to drastically change, and we would call that more of a natural phenomena. So, I mean, I think we're getting into more philosophy on that side, but in general, yes, I agree with your statement. If humans are actively disturbing an area, it's going to have higher calcium carbonate in the open than it would if it was undisturbed.
Right. I might be getting off topic here. From what I understood in Cogbooks, it's like, there's like a natural balancing act. So in one area where there might be an excess release, there probably would be more settling out in a different area. But that's not happening through our extraction and all of that.
Sure. Yeah, I guess if there was like a big release and it drifted elsewhere, it would settle elsewhere. So you would have different levels at different places, and there would be more natural cycles occurring than consistent like fishing practices potentially or other mining practices.
Okay, sorry, I got a little off topic.
No, that's all right. It's still generally related to what we're talking about, just maybe a little bit more detail than we need to know for the exam, but still interesting information.
I have a question about one of the questions on the the learning objectives. It was
Sure.
on number 6, it was describe the major aspects of global change that threaten biodiversity on Earth. I feel like I know the answer, but when it says introduce species, does that mean invasive species, or does that just mean species, or does that mean species reintroduction? Could it
So-
be either?
It could be either, and that's a good question. What's the difference definition wise between an introduced and an invasive species?
So an invasive, well, I think either one. I think invasive is an introduced species that is not native to the area and has the capability of overtaking and becoming a keystone species in a negative way, and has a negative competition effect on other native species. But then a reintroduced species is a species that has gone extinct from an ecosystem and has been reintroduced after its extinction.
Yes. I don't know if I said it. I didn't mean to ask about reintroduced. I was just asking about introduced versus invasive.
Oh, okay. I would assume that an introduced species is just one that's not native to any specific ecosystem and has been introduced.
Yes. And then how does that differ from invasive then?
An invasive species is an introduced species, I guess, but it's
Yep.
not native to that area and it overtakes the other native species in that area.
Yeah, I think you're definitely on the right track. So the way I would kind of word it is they're both introduced species, an introduced and an invasive are both introduced. So they're species that are not, they're found in a region that they're not native to. And the big difference is to be considered invasive, it has to cause a negative effect on that environment. So you could have introduced species that are good for the environment or neutral, and they're not considered invasive because they're not essentially deteriorating or destroying that environment, having a negative effect.
Okay.
But to get back to the actual, I think, the question, what was it? You said that was number 6?
Number 6, yeah.
Yeah, so that said, just as a reminder, it said describe the major aspects of global change that threaten biodiversity on Earth. So climate change, introduced species, overconsumption, and habitat destruction. Yeah, so that is just having you define, and each one of those was like a section of cogbooks. So does anybody want to, like this, we can talk about them. So if you talk about climate change, what are some of the negative effects that are affecting the threatened biodiversity from climate change? The cogbooks talked about.
Habitat loss, like habitat loss and habitat fragmentation.
Widening species ranges.
Yeah, so it could actually lead to potential invasive species because it can change their range a little bit.
Actually, you know what, speaking, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was gonna, speaking of that, of like the idea of the fact that animals and plants are now moving northern, more north areas because of climate change, could we say now that invasive species are not necessarily introduced species? Or are they still considered introduced species because they're not native?
That's a good question. I think with introduced, it has to be introduced by humans, right? To be an introduced species.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, so you could technically have it, if it's moving north from its current range and it's just expanding, I don't even know if we would call that an invasive species. We would just say that that species distribution is shifting and its niche has now changed due to environmental changes. So
Okay.
it's like it's new to the region due to responsive climate change. It was able to kind of invade northward or move northward. And if it maintains, then it's, if it moved 10 miles north or 100 miles north this year, and then in 20 years, we would just say that's its current range. So I think it depends on how fast it's moving and if it's reproducing in that range.
Okay. And then if that migration of that species ends up having a negative effect on that ecosystem, on other species, would we then say, yes, this is an invasive species?
I don't think we would call it an invasive species because it moved there naturally. It just, if it would jump from like one side of the mountain to the other side of the mountain, that could potentially be an invasive species because it's not covering the entire range. Now it just
Okay.
went to a new patch. But if it's just pushing its current range northward, I don't believe that falls under the definition of an invasive species.
Okay.
It's just a range shift, we could call it.
Okay.
What about gases? As far as we go back to the question, like when talking about climate change.
Like, you're referring to greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so that's one of the negative effects of climate change that Cogbook's talked about a little bit. And what is the greenhouse effect? Like what's going on there briefly?
The greenhouse effect is, things like carbon dioxide absorb infrared like heat and then reflect it back at Earth, which is what warming up the overall temperature of the planet.
Yeah, so then yeah, exactly. And that gets into the next one, that there's warmer temperatures that are being caused by greenhouses effects. And what are some of the negative effects of these warmer temperatures that the Earth is experiencing?
Temperature extremes and up like across the globe. Why am I blanking right now?
Yeah, there were some specific examples or phenomena that Cogbook's talked about. And it does involve, go ahead.
Sorry, I keep cutting people off. I'm so sorry. I think I'm like lagging in my ear. But one of them was that many species of plants are now flowering earlier, which is causing possible starvation for other species that might not have migrated during that annual time of year.
Yeah, that's a good example. Do you remember what that's called?
No.
Or a phenology shift? So the phenology, the life cycle essentially of the plant is shifting. And that's exactly what Cogbook's talked about. And that's creating mismatches. So if they flower early and insects are either waking up or migrating later and the flowering has already ended, then they miss their food source, right? So that if that creates a mismatch, then you have a huge die-off. If those insects die off, all their predators are going to have, lack of food, and that can have this rippling effect that can, go up the food chain.
And then one of the other examples was sea level rise because of the heating up of melting of polar ice caps.
Yep, that's one of the other examples I have in my notes too. Yeah, so rising ocean levels, and that leads to lost shoreline, so loss and change of habitats. It also changes the potential salinity of the ocean, especially near the ice. It's going to be a lot less, there's more fresh water being put into the ocean. It's going to reduce that salinity, which can be bad for some aquatic saltwater organisms. It also changes the other chemistry. So it changes the pH levels of the ocean in certain areas. So that's, going to potentially put certain organisms into a state of shock that they can't handle different shifts in pH or salinity.
Can also create seawater intrusion in groundwater basins.
Yep, it can do that too. And then the last one we kind of talked about a little bit already with the discussion of invasive species. So it's just the northern expansion or the shift in species distributions. That's another thing that's directly caused by warming temperatures that are caused by the greenhouse effect. All right, so that covers like global climate change pretty well. And then the next thing it asks about is introduced species. So now that we've defined those, let's talk about how is that having a negative impact on on the regions where they're introduced. And it doesn't have to be that it's 100% of the time it's negative, but if it is a negative example, what are some of those factors, or what are they negatively doing to their environment?
Would it be like pathogens that are moving?
Yep, that could be one example for sure. If they bring in, new pathogens that they're resistant to, but the native animals are not, that can cause, essentially that can go back, we could call that a potential apparent competition. That could be introduced there.
It could be things where like an introduced species, you know, I'm gonna use domestic cats as the example, where they are, you know, having a huge effect on songbirds globally.
Yep, that's an example that Cogbooks talked about. You know, so that's, you know, we bring house cats as pets all across the country. They're not native to the entire region or maybe any of it. Let them outside and they kill for sport because it's instinctual for them, but it is doing a lot of damage to the songbird population. It's doing a lot of damage to the small mammal population. It's also introducing possible disease to wildcats, like feline leukemia could potentially be spread from house cats to like bobcats or other organisms if they get in contact with these cats.
Shading out and then like competing for nutrients. So not only sunlight, but also just nutrients within the soil.
So that would be specifically more plants, right? You're just,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think I agree with that. Big picture, that could just be viewed as there's increased competition now, right? You have new competitors in an area. So there's limited resources when you bring in more organisms or more competitors. So there was a term that Cogbooks talked about too called biotic homogenization. Does anybody remember what that is describing?
It's where areas that used to be very different ecologically start to become more alike, like where there's less diversity across all those areas.
Yeah, so if we're having a pathogen come in as an example, kill off native animals in two like adjoining regions, the survivors that are there are going to be similar because they have similar ways of fighting it off. And those two regions that used to be very different with different types of organisms are now going to be similar because they're going to have more of the same organisms that are surviving. So that's the homogenization part.
Would like non-native plant species taking over an area and homogenizing a species composition, like plant species composition, be related?
Yeah, that could be another example. If there's a certain type of grass that comes in, maybe it takes over all different parts of the prairie that had different grasses in different regions, but this new introduced species is a superior competitor, now an invasive species, it homogenizes the entire prairie region. It essentially reduces the biodiversity of different like neighboring regions.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's pretty good for introduced species. What about the third one, overconsumption? How would we describe that, and how does that have a negative effect on the environment and biodiversity?
Is that like specifically human overconsumption?
Yeah,
For that, I would say the over extraction of fossil fuels, like mining and like coal mining and oil digging is ruining a lot of habitats by disturbing the natural layout of the land.
yeah, I think that those are good examples. There's a few more examples we could add to that. Does anybody remember from Cogbooks too? What other things humans consume at high levels?
Would be overfishing and over hunting.
Yep, overfishing, overhunting certain regions. Those are also great examples.
Like corn and soybeans potentially as well, because that's a complete monoculture that doesn't really contribute to the environment, and that agricultural loop is caused by the overconsumption of those two products.
Yeah, I think that would work because clearing a field gets rid of multiple species, right? And if you have a single one that you replace it with and you overconsume it, you're going to have to destroy habitat in order to make room for those new farm fields of the monoculture. What's another organism that humans consume at, large rates, and they use it in construction?
Timber.
Trees.
Yeah, timber, exactly. So wood, that's a big thing that humans overconsume, forests. And that has rippling effects because that removes homes, food, and habitat from other organisms. And if they say there's a forest in your farmland, they want to expand their field, they cut that forest down and then make it a monoculture. This essentially just removes all biodiversity of that area. And eventually, the big cause is it can lead to extinction of the organisms in the area if they're overconsumed. The trees themselves or the fields taking away homes from certain organisms. Overfishing can remove complete fishery populations.
Oh, that segues into another question I have. For number 7 on the learning objectives, under the extinction, which groups of animals and plants are most at threat of extinction?
Mhm.
Is this just referring to the material covered under like the International Union for Conservation of Nature, like under that section?
It's
Yeah, and-
specifically referring to this figure with these pie charts.
Okay, so like we're talking about the conifers, birds, reptiles, mammals, and amphibians, because they did talk about like flowering plants are not, there's not enough data to evaluate that group yet.
Yeah, so my understanding for 7 is it's this figure, and this figure will show up on the exam. And when it
Okay.
talks, and so knowing how to interpret this. So yeah, so for this question, it says, which group of animal is most threatened by extinction? So which one would we say is for this one and why?
Amphibians.
I would agree. And why would amphibians be the most concern for extinction?
They have the highest population of threatened.
Yeah,
species
right?
that are threatened.
Yeah, so they have the biggest orange slice, which means threatened. And they also have some animals or some part that are near threatened. So 50% is threatened or near threatened, right? Conifers is pretty close. It has about 50% in those two categories as well, but there's a little bit more blue and a little less orange compared to amphibians. So that's why if we're going to compare them, this one might be a little bit more concerned than this one. So just being able to interpret this one, it could be the opposite question. Which one of these is the least concern and why? Which one do we think is the least concern?
Birds.
The bird.
Yeah, I would agree with that too, right? It has, first of all, it has the least amount of orange, and then it has not a lot of blue. So just, 77%, or there's a couple of them that are, the fish are also least concern at the same number, but it has more orange, so it has more threatened organisms, fish, or more species of fish than birds are threatened. So I think that one should be there'll be pretty straightforward questions with that along those lines. Just being able to interpret these pie charts would be important. Let's go back to number 6 real quick and just finish that one up. Because the last one then that it talks about is habitat loss. So how would we describe habitat loss, and how does this threaten biodiversity on Earth?
Part of it we learned in one of the earlier modules, but it increases the amount of edge habitat to where the point that I think it was the cowbirds, like they're like parasitic birds
Mhm.
that live on edge habitats, so they're able to be a superior competitor to a lot of other bird species
Yep, I would
because their
agree.
habitat's been disrupted.
Yeah, so in that case, we would say habitat has been fragmented, because in order to get more edge, you have to take, like, if you have a circle, it has to be broken up into smaller chunks. And if it's broken up, then it definitely, as you said, it creates more edge, and it can lead to the increase in edge species, which are often very competitive. And the one example of the cowbird species that's an actual parasitic bird, that could lead to declines or high levels of competition or parasitism of other species of bird and reduce their biodiversity. And what else? What happens to population sizes when you shrink the size of the habitat?
They shrink as well.
Yeah, and why are smaller populations more vulnerable to extinction than larger populations?
With having a less number of species, it makes them less resilient. So if a pathogen or a predator were to come in, their population could easily be more dwindled because of the lower total population size.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a numbers game, right? If you have 10 individuals or 1,000 individuals and a pathogen is introduced, it's more likely that that's, of those 10 individuals, if all the females die, there's a higher probability of that. And then that population is not going to be able to reproduce. But it's a higher probability that some individuals out of the 1,000 will be resilient and will survive and be able to recover potentially from that, a pathogen introduction or a invasive predator.
Well, and also if you have more individuals, you're more likely to have genetic diversity, right? So some of
Yep.
them might be resistant to that pathogen.
Exactly. And that'd be why they would be resistant. So even more detailed. Great. Yeah, so I think that covers habitat loss. I mean, just part of the definition is the destruction or degradation of that habitat. And it could be through natural phenomena such as volcanoes or tornadoes or flooding, or it could be human induced, such as construction, creating farmland, clear cutting forest, or building, buildings or subdivisions to completely make it less diverse for other organisms and more beneficial for humans.
Would that also go back to what we learned in previous topics or previous modules about how like the habitat size, the like larger habitat size, so say like a smaller island would have less diversity and a larger island would have greater diversity. Would that kind of translate or transfer in that realm as well?
Yes, thinking along those lines would be good but it's just kind of more directional in this case. Like, so it would always be habitat loss would be like you have loss of space. So you like built a building in place of part of a forest, and like that would be how the habitat was lost. But you could think of that as the same lines or the same information goes from going from a big island to a small island. It's just instead of going from big to small, you're going from untouched habitat to either totally or partially destroyed habitat. But the same principles of why the population is smaller and what we just talked about do apply.
Okay.
This is just a little more like we're creating a smaller island because we destroyed part of it.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense.
I have one more question not related to that. It's a different section.
Sure.
For the seral stages, I only saw 2 of them in COB books, like actually explained as to, like what they are, which was the pioneer and the climax communities. I know that there's more actual stages in there, but do we have to know like the names of them and what exactly they are? Because I like looked online a little bit and I thought there were more, but I didn't see that in COG books.
No, and that's number 1 from the topics and learning objectives. I'm glad you brought this point up. It should say define succession and recognize the 2 serial stages, primary stage and climax stage, because that's the only 2 that Cogbooks talks about.
Okay.
So why don't we go ahead, we can answer it. So the first part says define succession. How do we define succession?
The change in the species composition over time.
Yep. So it's an active process, and that process is exactly what was said, the change in community or species composition over time. So make sure having the 2 parts in there, the change in species composition and over time. It's not immediate. And then what are the 2 serial stages that Cogbooks talks about?
Pioneer and climax.
Yep. And then how do we describe pioneer species?
That one was the first species to arrive at a specific site.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they're
Would that-
typically like good dispersers, like have good seed dispersal and most likely shallow root systems so that, they don't need deep soil to adhere to, and they are hardy plants.
Yep. Yeah, because they typically arrived at disturbed sites. So, one example could be a volcanic eruption where it doesn't have a lot of soil on top of the hardened magma. So they can't rely on having a deep root system. It could be that it's a disturbed site that maybe a lot of the topsoil is blown away, so there's no point in digging into the soil. They can invest more of their energy into the shoots system so they can absorb more sunlight and conduct more photosynthesis and more seeds and spread them that way. What about a climax community? How do we describe that?
Would that,
This one will be have very little seeds and large size, right?
It can be that, but there's a more simple way we would describe just the whole climax community, not maybe the individuals, but
It's an established community.
yeah. I mean, a pioneer species could be considered an established community too, to an extent, like once they establish.
Is it the species that dominates the biome?
I think we're all kind of generally on track. The way I'm going with this is it's just the final serial stage. So it could be the dominant ones that are the they keep it stable. So I think putting those together works pretty well.
would specialization also apply into that realm or that section as well?
In what sense?
So like say an oak tree is like a pioneer or not a pioneer, like a climax species. Say that area were to be cleared and like, you know, tulip poplars, maples, beeches and things like that were popping up. And then as the forest continued to grow and the soil chemistry began to change and those species began to die off, and then oaks came in and were able to specialize and then establish a climax community, which would then eliminate maples, beeches, and things of that sort. Would specialization or opportunism, like would specialization refer more to the climax community and then opportunism refer to like the pioneer?
I think it could go either way because we talked about, I mean, you have to have certain specialists that can actually live in these disturbed sites where the pioneer species start. So you could say some of those are pretty specialized to live in low soil quality or high acidity or low water quality or low nutrient quality. I think ultimately with the climax community is they're the top competitors because they're the ones that move in and nothing removes them other than either humans or some type of natural disaster. They remain stable as the climax community until something drastic changes that environment.
Okay.
Some of them can be specialists, like if that example with the oak tree, they're the only ones that can survive in that type of soil. That is just the climax community then, right? Because they're specialists that are able to survive in a more unique and limited environment.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I don't know if you already said this or not, but are they also considered slow growing? Like they take longer to get established?
Generally, yeah, they are generally more slow growing because they can tend to get bigger, as was mentioned earlier too. Because that kind of relates to, there's another question, number 9. Yeah, because this gets into more detail now. Contrast the phenotypes of pioneer species and climax species and explain how these phenotypes help pioneer species colonize a new site or help climax species persist during competition. So let's just do some comparisons. There's 9 traits that Cogbooks talked about versus early succession or pioneer species compared to late succession climax species. And we'll just kind of go through them. So if we talk about number of seeds, how would we describe that for early succession species compared to late succession?
Early would have a lot and late would have a few.
Yeah, so many seeds versus few seeds. What about seed size?
Pioneer
Small versus large.
So what
pioneer
was it?
species have small seeds.
Yep. Yeah, and late succession have larger seeds. What about the mode of dispersal? How do early succession seeds tend to spread?
For the wind or being stuck to animals.
Yeah, and that's related probably to their size, right? They're smaller, there's many of them, they're lighter, so they can blow in the wind or stick to an animal without too much trouble. And then how do late succession seeds tend to disperse?
Through like tertiary or secondary seed dispersal, so like through an animal consuming it and then yeah, defecating it and then
Mhm.
it germinating from that point.
Yeah, what was another example Cogbooks gave?
Gravity.
Yeah, it's just falling to the ground, right? They tend to fall because they're heavier, they're larger. They'll get taken out of the tree by gravity a little bit, and sometimes they just have the nutrition in the fruit maybe they fell with to grow in that general vicinity, or they get eaten by another animal and dispersed elsewhere. So what about seed viability? How does that, how would we describe seed viability for late succession species?
Would they be more
Viability.
viable?
In terms of time?
Short.
Yeah, so for late succession, they're not viable for very long, right? They have short-term viability. And early succession, again, are the opposite. So they're going to have longer term viability. And why would that be beneficial for an early succession or pioneer species to be have a more viable seed?
It can disperse over a longer, like over a greater area if it has a longer viability. Like say the habitat, the conditions aren't favorable for it to grow right at that moment, but when the conditions do become favorable, like they can lay dormant for a long time, but then when conditions become favorable, they can grow quickly.
Exactly. They go to disturbed, low quality sites, right? That's generally where we see these pioneer species. So if it's too low quality, they're going to have to wait a little bit until it improves enough until they can actually grow. So if they're the viability, they can live longer without having nutrients. They're more viable. You know, that's beneficial for them going to these disturbed and low quality sites. What about growth rate? How is that? What is the growth rate like for an early succession species?
It'll be fast.
Yeah. And then what a late succession would be slow. And why is it beneficial to have a fast growth rate for pioneer species?
They tend to have a shorter life cycle or lifespan. And so that with competition and, you know, the area being cleared or disturbed, it would be more beneficial for them to be able to germinate more quickly.
Yeah,
and to
right.
grow into reproduction more quickly.
You mentioned competition. They drop tons of seeds compared to late succession. So if, you know, hundreds or thousands of seeds go to an area and all land kind of in the same vicinity, the fastest growing ones are going to outcompete the slower growing ones. So it allows them to live and allows them to reproduce. So it increases their fitness in order to grow fast because they grow in these, you know, under high levels of competition generally. Now, what about size at maturity?
Pioneer species would be smaller and the climax species would be larger.
Yep. Why are climax species generally able to get to a larger size?
They have a larger root system.
They
Like,
do,
they
but what
Have
allows
more
them to
time
have
to
that?
grow. Kind of.
I'm getting at the site difference. Like we talked about early succession or at disturbed or low quality sites. Where do we tend to find how would we describe the sites for climax species?
Once the climax species come in, the pioneer has already like created more nutrients like in the soil.
Yeah, so yeah, what I was trying to get at is they're generally in a higher nutrient area. And some of that is from the pioneer species. They come in, they outcompete them, they die, their nutrients go into the soil when they decompose. And it's generally, if it was a place that was highly disturbed, through succession, it's built up the nutrients, they've recovered in that area. So the climax species have more nutrients that they can generally grow to a larger size then. And then what about shade tolerance? How does that compare to early succession versus late succession?
Pioneer species have low shade tolerance. the climax species tend to have a high shade tolerance or be the source of shade themselves.
Yeah, so if we go to a competition, if a pioneer species comes into, say, an area with a lot of grasses that are covering the area, they're not super tall, but they do produce a little bit of shade. But say a bigger tree gets planted, it's shade tolerant, it can take its time to grow through the, and then eventually shade out the grass, right? And that's how it'll kind of transition that succession. The bigger plants that are shade tolerant will then kill off the smaller non-shade tolerant pioneer species.
So I have a question with regards to what you just mentioned. So does that mean that the pioneer species, they are not, they don't survive in, what do you call it? Like, environmental factors. If the environmental factors are harsher, they are not as hardy? Or is it the opposite? Am I confusing myself?
I think it's the opposite. Generally, pioneer species are more hardy and can survive in lower quality areas because they tend to colonize, vacant or disturbed areas.
Okay.
But they're not great competitors. So they'll colonize an area and grow, but then as that area improves and it takes more time for more climax species to disperse there because they're larger, they don't disperse as far usually, and they don't have as many seeds or offspring, so it will take them more time to reach that area. Once they do reach that area, they will be better competitors and start to outcompete the early pioneer species. And then that's where we get that shift in succession. We get that change in species composition over time.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So I feel about the only question we haven't answered off of the topics and learning objectives is number 5. And that one says, explain how scientists identify hotspots of biodiversity. And there's some very specific examples that Cogbooks talked about for identifying hotspots of biodiversity. Do we remember what some of those are that scientists do and how they identify them? What kind of metrics they use?
Endemic species, like in a area.
Yeah, so they'll find areas with high number of endemic species.
And then they also did like species or areas that were threatened, like they were about to undergo construction or something like that.
And yeah, that is, I think, something they talked about a little bit. What about, instead of endemic species, what other kind of species do they look for? Or not species, but areas concerning species.
Areas that have experienced 70% of vegetation loss. Is that one of the ones?
That's more specific than my notes, but
Species richness.
yeah, so that's where I was getting at, is they look at areas that have high species richness without the focus of endemic species. And why is that beneficial? If they can identify areas that have high species richness, what do they want to do with those areas?
Protect them.
Yeah, right. Because if you have an area, you have one forest that has a really high species richness and another area that has lower species richness, and you have to pick which one you're going to protect. With the one with more species richness, it's an umbrella way of protecting more overall species. It's a more fruitful area. You're less likely to have certain extinctions because you're going to protect the most number of species possible. And I think we said the last one, because in my notes, the last one is they also prioritize species-rich locations that face the highest current or projected threats of species extinctions. And that could be because of climate change, or it could be because of possible construction desires, where if people want to develop a certain area, they might not allow them to develop in one area because the species richness is really high and they want to keep it high, so they'll make them develop somewhere else potentially.
Would like sunlight and rainfall come into account with like species richness as well?
It can, because usually more like the tropics are have high species richness and they tend to have a fair amount of sunfall or sunlight and rainfall. So it can go into fact, if they would probably build some type of species diversity model that would be based off of abiotic factors such as those. And they could, I'm not aware of a specific one, but I could see that, easily being implemented. I don't think cogbooks went into that much detail, but that's a good possibility. And why do they focus on certain areas? Why don't they just focus on everywhere and preserve everything?
Because that's even more unrealistic given political and economic pressures. I mean,
Sure.
it's already difficult
But
to
they should.
conserve those areas that they focus on, but because there's species richness there's greater political buy-in and greater support for the general public.
Yeah, so I mean, there's no, I think one absolute answer I was looking for, but there's support, right? If they can get support, what does support bring with it?
Money.
Yep, that's one. And then another is, human manpower, right? Resources are limited. That's the kind of the idea I was getting at. We don't have unlimited money and unlimited time or unlimited resources to preserve everything. So if we focus our efforts to these biodiversity hotspots, it can big picture, long-term, have more impactful results than kind of trying to spread ourselves really thin and focus on everything. So are there any other specific questions or topics or anything we wanted to go over at this point?
I apologize. I just got off work. I got on late, but did you say that you went through all the study guide questions?
We didn't go through them one by one. We hit a lot of them individually, but some of them overlapped. But if you want to go over another specific one, I mean, we're more than welcome to do it again.
No, I'll watch the video. I have a couple questions that's not related to the study questions.
Sure.
Are we going to, where is it? Are we going to have to memorize the molecular structure for, like the section that dealt with the carbons, the different molecular structures for water? Gosh, I can't even think right now.
Yeah, the chemical compounds.
Yes.
You are going to have to be able to recognize them. Yeah, you will not have to write out nitric oxide equals NO, but you will have to, if it has the chemical compounds, recognize what is happening in that that chemical equation.
Okay.
It's not going to be, a quarter of the exam of those questions, but there will be a couple of questions in that, from those activities that are going to look very similar.
Oh, okay. Let's see. That's it. You already talked about the other stuff that I was wondering about. Thank you.
No problem.
We didn't really talk about the efficiency equations, and I understand those, but there was only one example in the back in cogbooks, but we could probably expect to see something like that, right?
Yeah,
Like
so
like ecological efficiency.
Yes. So if you're given a table with sub data and it might contain like one column will be the ecological process and the other column will be energy in the form of joules. It might give you, say, net primary production and then ask you to calculate the consumption efficiency, or it might ask you to calculate the net secondary production based on the information in that table, which will be very much like that example. And you'll just have to know how many of those equations and which ones you need to do in order to get to that step. So you will need a calculator likely for the exam. Or I mean, you could probably do it by hand on scratch paper, but a calculator will be useful. And that's why I give you the note card so you can write out all of those efficiency calculations and pick which one, know where to plug it in. It has the information that tells you what to plug in. Take that information from the table, like the example, and then do the appropriate calculation, what it asks for.
Okay, thank you.
Will there be any questions on Jacquard's index of similarity?
That is free game for the exam.
Okay. I feel like it's fairly straightforward though. There's an example in Cogbooks that the example didn't quite match the chart, but I feel as though I understand it. So A would just be the number of species in community A, B is just the number of species in community B, and then X would be the number of species occurring in both A and B. So the
Yeah,
similar species.
The overlap between the two communities. Yeah, if they contain the same species, then that number of same species would be X. And there was a question from another student about community C, and they brought up the fact that it was not used in the equation, but the Jacquard index it only compares two communities at once. So the example compared community A and B. You could compare A and C and B and C, and you would just replace A and B and C with each other. So if you use community C, you would have like A plus B, or A plus C rather, instead of B, and C would equal the number of species in community C. Does that make sense to the group? Okay.
Yeah, and X would just be the overlap between
Yeah.
the two, because it only looks at two.
Yeah, and whatever A and B are in that example, you could technically have a 1 and a 2 or something, like community 1, community 2. They don't do that because it's a math problem and it would mess it up, but you would just say 1 equals the number of this and 2 equals the number of this. They're essentially just A and B are just placeholders in that equation, and just understanding why they're there and what they represent is important, as you described. So
Can we have that equation on the note card or no? That's
yeah, you could put that equation on the note card.
Okay.
That's a mathematical equation. Any mathematical equation from this section you can put on there, just not the chemical compounds, because those are not the math equations. That's what the note card announcement was meant for, or meant to describe, I should say. But also with the efficiency calculations, do understand them conceptually as well, right? So there's going to be some conceptual questions about them too.
Are we gonna need to also know how to do the energy resistance formulas? Biomass resistance?
No, I'll just say that those will not be on the exam in math form. Maybe those will potentially be conceptually on the exam, but you won't have to do those calculations. The only math you'll have to do are the related to the efficiency calculations.
Okay.
And then one topic we didn't talk about from the questions too that I just popped into my head is which type of community, an aquatic community or a terrestrial community, would have greater efficiency?
Aquatic.
I agree, and why?
Because of the higher number of lower tertiary species, so there would be more like like microorganisms in that community, and larger keystone species consume those microorganisms.
That's part of it. There's multiple parts to this. There's multiple reasons why.
Is
that
it
is-
the higher efficiency?
Yeah, that we're asking why aquatic has a higher efficiency.
Oh, I don't have my notes in front of me.
Would
That's
it be
fair.
because of the direct tertiary connection, or not? Yeah, the direct connection of higher tertiary species consuming lower tertiary species.
That's-
So like primary consumers being higher in the web, consuming primary producers, or well, primary producers, primary consumers, and then keystones consuming.
I don't think Cogbooks really goes into that much detail there. There's a few other details they do mention that I want to make sure we get at. So
This
what
is the
about,
one where-
Go
I
ahead.
think the equation really helped me with this one. So it's like the consumption efficiency, because like phytoplankton are consumed in their entirety and all of those nutrients are absorbed by the next level up, right?
yeah, so I think it's getting at what you're getting at, Kyle, like one of them is size of the food. So if we think about primary producers in the water, what are the top primary producers in aquatic systems?
Algae.
Yeah, like algae, and they're really small, right?
Mhm.
So as Aaron said, those are consumed in entirety. And does algae contain a lot of defenses for their predators?
Nope.
Do plants on land contain more defenses?
Nope. I wouldn't think so. Oh, well, I mean, maybe there are like phytochemicals within certain plants that are
Well,
deterrent.
even morphological structures. Think about like plants on land. Like is every part of a lot of terrestrial plants edible?
No,
No,
woody
Yeah.
stems are.
Yeah, they invest a lot of energy into non-edible parts. And so that's a lot of lost energy right there. So even if, say, an entire plant is eaten, the animal's going to assimilate a lot less of it on land than they do if they eat algae, right? That's a much more energy efficient organism than, say, a tree, because they're not going to eat the bark. They're not going to eat the woody part. They really just want to eat the leaves from a tree for the most part, other than certain insects maybe eat the wood. But other plants, there's a lot of plants that, like you said, have chemical defenses. Some of them have structural defenses, such as thorns. A lot of trees grow tall, so that's lower level or shorter animals can't eat their leaves, so they have to grow their trunk thicker and wider to reach that height. So they have fewer defenses in aquatic organisms, and they're easier for the consumers to digest. Is one of the big reasons why there's more energy efficiency in aquatic systems.
And then that's why there's more trophic levels.
Yeah, and ultimately aquatic systems will have more trophic levels because less energy is leaked as you go up each trophic level, so you can have more. And the terrestrial systems simply just run out of energy, and the trophic levels end sooner because they're less efficient.
This sort of clicked for me because it's like, I think it was when we were talking about decomposition and nutrient cycles, like 70% of plant matter is like decomposes, and so it's not consumed on land, whereas in the ocean there's a really high consumption rate of the phytoplankton. While there might be a lot of it, it's constantly being consumed.
Yep. Exactly, yeah. There is a section in Cogbooks that talks about this in a bit more detail. So it might be worth reviewing too a little bit, but I think we got the basics of it right now, so. Does anybody have any more questions or any topics else they want to talk about?
I have a quick question. Will the questions related to the formulas, consumption efficiency and all that, will they look similar to the questions posed in the actual module, like in T20, for example, the activity conversion efficiencies? Are they going to be presented in that manner?
I will
Is-
open that.
Are you able to say that?
I get what you're getting at. The answer is yes and no. So when you have to do the calculations, the math is gonna look, you're gonna get tables that are gonna look similar to some of the tables that you got in COG books, but there are also gonna be some conceptual questions about energy efficiency that
Okay,
are not gonna look overly familiar.
okay,
Yeah, so you'll get something that. I'll share my screen real quick. Yeah, you're gonna get a type of table, something like this that tells you what level of the consumption calculation you're on, and then you're gonna get data in here, and it might ask you for one specific, so you have to pick out the right data and then calculate. It might ask you what is the assimilated, efficiency. So you have to know how far into the table you have to go in order to get that answer. But yeah, you'll get a data table that'll look very similar to this, and then have to know which calculation to use. And that's why I allow the note card, so you can have the formulas on there, but you still have to know how to apply it and how to plug the numbers in.
okay. All right, thank you.
I don't have any other questions, but I just want to say, since this is our last exam and last office hours, thank you so much for holding these. They are probably the saving grace of this class besides our Discord chat. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad they're worthwhile, and I appreciate all of you honestly coming to these. And for those of your classmates that can't make the times that we post, I'm sure they all appreciate that too. So this has been a good portion or part of the class for me too.
Yes, very helpful.
And I will say too, if filling out the course evaluations is important for comments like that. So keep in mind, I didn't create the course is all I'll say, but about the course itself, when you're evaluating it, be honest, say the shortcomings of the course itself, what you would like to see different about it. People do read those. And if there's a high enough level of complaints, that is when, changes can be made. So if your future classmates, or I guess they won't be kind of classmates, would appreciate that.
Oh, yeah, I did. I said almost exactly that. So I really appreciate it. It would have been helpful. I know it's not your choice, but lectures would be very helpful with this, or like supplemental lectures.
And I fully agree with that. A hybrid version of this course, I think, could be more efficient for sure.
I think I would have enjoyed the material a lot more. But anyway, thank you very much. I gotta log off, but
Okay.
good luck everybody on the exam tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Travis.
No problem. Yep. Hope everybody does well tomorrow. And the other thing I'll add is just the course does end tomorrow, but I will be, available through email if there are questions or concerns. Grades have to be posted by the end of the week, so there is limited time to talk about the exams. So if you have questions or concerns on exam 5 or even previous exams, make sure to do those in the next few days before grades are posted. And also, grades are not, once they're posted, they're pretty final, but if there is a mistake that it doesn't match your grade doesn't match the letter grade that's in the syllabus, like a plus minus kind of situation, it is possible to fix that. So also please do reach out if you feel that you did not, get the grade that the syllabus said you should have. I can email the registrar and request a grade change to fix that kind of issue.
Will there be a chance for any type of corrections on exam 5 at all with the class sitting so closely to the?
There will be,
meeting of the
but it
exam?
is going to be short-lived because because they do want grades, as I said, this week, so they have to be in within probably, your questions have to be in within a few days of the exam closing. And
Okay,
you should be able to see, you'll see half of it as normal right away. And then when your short answers are in, check those out when you see them, and within a day or two, make sure to ask the question. They can't be prolonged for indefinitely,
yeah, that makes sense. And I also want to apologize for sending everyone a direct message, or a meeting in the chat. I meant to send it to Serena, who asked me a question, but I ended up sending it to everyone.
No worries.
The extra credit was due today, right? The extra credit questions.
I believe it's due at the end of today, but let me double check that. Yeah, because I wanted it in before the exam started, was my intent, so that you're not doing it while the exam is, yeah, so it's due today by 11:59 p.m. Arizona time.
Okay, thank you.
All right, if there's no more questions, I want to thank all of you, for a great semester and for coming to these office hours. And if you have questions, I still have, email availability, but I think we can call it a session and let everybody go back to studying.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
You.
Thank you.